My name is Alara Vance. I am 36 years old, and my hand didn't tremble once when I was sewing up strangers on an operating table at 3:00 inches the morning. A year after my divorce, I was finishing my shift near the maternity ward of Chicago Central General Hospital. That was when my ex-mother-in-law spotted me by the elevators. Vivian Sterling had a smile that reminded you of a heavy oak door clicking shut. She walked straight up to me, puffed up like she was at a Sunday country club brunch, and said it just loud enough for the triage nurses to hear. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made. Now he has a beautiful baby boy with your best friend." 7 years of being called a broken, barren woman, all wrapped up in a single sigh. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her calmly, steady as a flatlining EKG, and replied, "Do you really believe that?" 5 minutes later, a man whom neither she nor my best friend had expected walked through those exact same doors, and the one name nobody wanted to see in writing was about to be read aloud in the Cook County Circuit Court. Welcome back to Stories of Quiet Drama, where composed women stand their ground against loud cruelty, and the truth takes its time, but never misses. If you enjoy quiet justice, get comfortable, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, and remember to subscribe. Let me take you back 5 minutes, because the smile happened before the man arrived. It was a Thursday, near the end of a grueling 12-hour shift, and I was handing over my patient charts to the night shift charge nurse, Holden. The maternity ward was just one corridor away from the ER trauma bay, where I worked, and I had walked past it 100 times without a second thought. Vivienne was there visiting. Of course she was. Sloane had given birth 3 weeks earlier, and half the wealthy elite of Lincoln Park had been parading through there with mylar balloons and boxes of designer macarons. I knew about it. I was prepared for it. What I wasn't prepared for was Vivienne intercepting my path like she had been waiting there all afternoon. She looked me up and down, her eyes scanning my wrinkled scrubs and exhausted eyes, and then she tilted her chin up. That's when she delivered her little speech about her son, her grandson, and my best friend. Holden stood next to me, frozen. A passing medical assistant slowed her pace, and I felt my thumb instinctively seek out the delicate gold watch on my wrist, the one that had belonged to my grandmother. I pressed against the glass dial, a grounding habit I'd had since childhood whenever I had to handle something I couldn't yet change. I didn't raise my voice. A long time ago, I learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who is right. "Do you really believe that?" I asked again. This time, softer. Vivienne blinked, genuinely taken aback by my absolute calm. She had expected tears, anger, or at least a quiver of the lip. She got none of it, and somewhere down that corridor, the automatic doors hissed open. Even though I still hadn't turned around to look, I didn't know who was walking in, but I knew what I had already set in motion. Here is what you need to know about me before the rest of this makes sense. I grew up in a farming town in Nebraska, a place where everybody's business is gospel to everyone else. My mother cleaned houses. My father drove a livestock feed truck until his lower back gave out. I worked 2 jobs while getting my undergrad degree at the University of Chicago, and 2 more during med school. I learned early on to keep my head down and let my work speak for me. That had been my entire life philosophy. Do your job well and in silence, and the truth will sort itself out. People will see who you really are. I believed in that the way some people believe in luck. It made me an excellent attending physician in the trauma ward, where there is 0 time for panic or long explanations. You just fix the bleeding puzzle in front of you and move to the next. The smell of the ER, that sharp scent of pure cotton, bleach, and the antiseptic that clings to everything, usually calmed me the second I walked in. It meant I was in a space where I excelled, a place where no one ever called me broken. I could run a code blue, set a shattered femur, and soothe a terrified child while throwing in stitches, all without a spike in my heart rate. But that same instinct that made me a rock under pressure had a dark side. I carried my own bags. I didn't ask for help. And when people started telling a story about me that wasn't true, I did the worst thing a quiet woman can do. I trusted that my silence would be enough. The hospital was the only place where no one dared to call me empty. The rest of my life, however, was a different story. I married Julian Sterling when I was 28. He was charming in that effortless, generational wealth kind of way that made strangers feel like they were the chosen ones. He remembered names, shook hands like he genuinely meant it. Half of Chicago society would have given an arm for him, and for the first few years, I would have too. We wanted children. We tried for a long time, and nothing happened. And that nothing happened took a seat in our Gold Coast Greystone like a third person at the dining table. After about 2 years, I did what any doctor would do. I suggested we both get tested. Simple blood work, a basic diagnostic workup, the exact routine things I ordered for my patients every single day. Julian refused. At first, he laughed it off. Then he got defensive. He said the Sterling men didn't have those kinds of issues. He packaged it in a neat little speech about faith, about how we shouldn't force things and should just leave it in God's hands. I pushed once, I pushed twice, and then I dropped it. Because you cannot physically drag a grown man into a fertility clinic. And since I still believed that silence was a form of patience, I went and got tested myself. My results were perfectly normal. I remember sitting in my car in the clinic's parking garage, reading the printed lab report, simultaneously relieved and profoundly confused. If it wasn't me, then what? I had no answers. I couldn't force the issue, and the longer the silence stretched, the easier it became for the people around me to invent their own narrative. By then, Julian had already started saying things quietly. First to his mother saying that maybe the issue was me, that maybe my body just couldn't do it. I didn't yet know how far a quiet lie could travel when the right person decides to give it wings. Vivienne Sterling ran the Charity Auxiliary Board in Lincoln Park, the way a 4-star general runs a military campaign. She had buried her husband when she was very young and raised Julian entirely on her own. At some point during those difficult years, she decided her son was the living proof that she hadn't failed. He was perfect because he had to be. If he wasn't, what had all her sacrifice bought? So when Julian whispered to her that the problem was likely me, Vivienne didn't question it for a microsecond. She took it and ran. It started small, a sympathetic sigh at a fundraising gala, a hand on someone's shoulder, a hushed tone. Poor Julian wants a family so badly. Then it grew teeth. At the autumn charity dinner that year, she introduced me to the wife of a major hospital donor with a heavily practiced look of pity. "This is Alara, my daughter-in-law," she said. "She's a doctor. You know, it really is such a shame about the children." The woman gave me a sad, knowing nod, and I realized that whatever story was being spun about me, it was entering rooms long before I did. I stood there in my elegant evening gown, holding a champagne flute, while Vivienne patted my hand as if I were the one in need of comforting. Then she said the phrase she would repeat for years, a phrase she delivered the way other people say grace. Some women just aren't built for it. She smiled when she said it. She believed it. That was the absolute worst part. She wasn't being cartoonishly evil. She was just repeating the polished, precise lie her son had handed her, completely unaware that the words were falsehoods dressed up in her own voice. I drove home that night and said nothing to Julian. I should have. But I was still waiting for the truth to sort itself out. Sloane had been my best friend since we were 15. We met in high school chemistry back in Omaha, and we stuck together through everything that followed. My move away for undergrad and med school, her string of startup jobs that never quite panned out, crossing state lines, and a dozen years of life. She was the one I called when my dad passed away. She stood beside me at my wedding in an emerald green dress and cried during my vows. So, when the high society gossip started cutting me to the bone, Sloane was the person I leaned on. She would come over to the Greystone with expensive wine, let me vent, and she always knew exactly what to say. Or at least, I thought she did. Looking back, every piece of comfort she offered had a hook buried inside it. "You're a highly successful trauma surgeon, Alara. Maybe motherhood just isn't your path. Julian adores you. Don't let his mother get in your head. You don't need a baby to be complete." Kind words, all of them, but they always pressed right on the exact same bruise. They always reminded me of what I supposedly lacked. I didn't notice back then how often her eyes drifted across the room to Julian, or how she started knowing details about his schedule that I had never told her. I was too busy being grateful that I had one person in my corner who didn't seem to judge me. She sat on the sofa in my own living room and told me I deserved better. And I nodded, never once considering for a single second that what she really meant was that she deserved my life. People like Sloane don't take what's yours all at once. They borrow it piece by piece, until one day you look up and it's entirely gone, and they are standing in the center of your life acting like they always belonged there. I trusted her completely. That was the second fatal mistake I didn't know I was making. Julian filed for divorce. I came home from a Tuesday shift to find a manila envelope on the kitchen island and his side of the walk-in closet half empty. He couldn't even wait until the weekend to tell me to my face. He moved directly into Sloane's high-rise condo in River North, and the narrative about me was immediately finalized. The circulating version of events was clean and utterly ruthless. Alara was cold. Alara was married to the ER. Alara couldn't give him children, and a man needs a legacy. The truth? Vivienne made sure every socialite, board member, and country club regular heard those exact words. Sloane, my Sloane, said absolutely nothing to correct it. The two people who had known me the longest allowed me to become a cautionary tale, and I didn't fight it because fighting it felt like admitting they were right. I didn't post a single word on social media. I didn't call mutual friends to defend my honor. I went to work the next morning, reset a teenager's dislocated shoulder, and told him everything was going to be okay. And it was okay. That felt like the only real, honest thing I had done all week. If you have ever swallowed a lie about yourself to keep the peace, to preserve a family, a friendship, or a reputation you spent years building, you know exactly what it tastes like. It tastes like blood you aren't allowed to spit out. Stay with me, because this is where I finally began to understand something crucial. The peace I was so desperately trying to maintain wasn't even mine to keep. It belonged to the people who were lying about me. They were the ones who needed me to stay quiet. Drop the word truth in the comments if you've ever been in that position. And keep listening, because the silence didn't last much longer. I want to tell you about the day the hospital board taught me that some things are actually worth making a noise over. The story stopped being just about my failed marriage the day it walked through the double doors of my hospital. For years, I had been next in line to be the chief of emergency medicine. I had authored the trauma protocols that half the hospitals in Cook County now used as their standard of care. The position was practically mine, and everyone in the administration knew it. Then, the whispers reached the search committee. There was no actual truth to be found, only the shape of a rumor. Dr. Vance's personal life is highly volatile. There are severe concerns about her judgment under stress. Have you heard about the divorce? About what her ex-husband's prominent family is saying? A board member, a man who regularly played golf with Julian's uncle, started asking probing questions about my capacity to lead in high-stakes situations as if I hadn't spent a decade keeping a flat heart rate while people were literally bleeding out on my gurneys. When the position was announced, it went to an outside hire with half my clinical hours and none of my protocol experience. I was told I was a phenomenal candidate. I was told it was a very difficult decision. They didn't tell me the real reason, but I grew up in a small town. I knew the exact sound of a verdict disguised as praise. That was the night something inside my chest permanently shifted. The lie about my body had cost me my marriage, and I let it happen because I thought enduring it was the dignified thing to do. But now, that same lie was infecting the one place I had never allowed anyone to touch. My work, my name, the thing I bled for. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage, exactly the way I had sat years ago reading my normal fertility results, and I realized that the silence I was so incredibly proud of came with a massive price tag, and someone else was quietly collecting the payouts. A senior nurse I trusted gave me the name of an attorney named Rosalind. Rosalind's office was located above a vintage record store in Wicker Park. She had reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair, and a way of looking at you like she was already 3 chess moves ahead. I told her everything: the marriage, the high society gossip, the hospital board, the lost chief position. She listened without interrupting once, which lawyers rarely do. And when I finally finished, she put her pen down. "What you're describing is defamation. Slander and libel," she said. "But I won't sugarcoat it. It's incredibly difficult to win." She laid it out for me with clinical precision. To win a defamation suit in Illinois, we would have to prove 3 specific things: that a false statement of fact was made, that it was published, spoken, or written to third parties, and that it caused me actual quantifiable damages. "You have the damages part locked down," she said. "A lost promotion is a number. The salary difference is a hard number. That's the easy part." I sat there, twisting my grandmother's gold watch around my wrist. "And the false part?" I asked. Rosalind looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "That's the part you have to be willing to fight for in public. They will argue that the statement is true. They will claim that you really were the reason the marriage was childless. To win, you have to be willing to prove that it wasn't you. My stomach hollowed out, because of course, I couldn't definitively prove that. My lab results were perfectly normal, but a normal result doesn't explicitly point the finger at anyone else. It only says the fault wasn't mine. I was this close to standing up and walking out. All of this felt like inviting the entire city of Chicago to dig through my medical history. Then Rosalind said the exact thing I needed to hear. Silence is not a virtue, Alara, when it costs you your career. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can possibly do for yourself is to force them to prove what they are saying. I didn't answer her immediately, but I didn't leave either. I spent 2 weeks turning it over in my mind. I am not an impulsive person. I make decisions the same way I read a complex patient chart slowly, and then all at once. I wrote down every single thing I stood to lose. The society circles that had watched me build my life in this city. My standing among people who already half believed the worst. The way people would talk, calling me a bitter, scorned woman suing her wealthy ex-husband's family out of petty revenge. I knew exactly what that narrative would look like, because they had already written most of it. But then I wrote a second column, my professional name, my life's work, the actual truth. And the simple, infuriating fact that I had done absolutely nothing wrong, yet I was serving the sentence for it anyway. It all came back to one core thing. I wasn't doing this to destroy Julian. If I wanted to ruin him, I'd had a year of opportunities to do so. I was doing this so the hospital board would stop believing a fabricated story. So the next time my name was brought up in a room I wasn't in, it was clean. That was the boundary I drew, and I drew it intentionally. This wouldn't be revenge. Revenge is loud, starving, and never satisfied. This would be the truth, spoken exactly once, on the record, by someone who had finally decided she was done carrying a lie that belonged to someone else. I called Rosalind on a Monday morning before my shift. I told her to file it. Good, she said. Let's make them say it under oath. I hung up, walked into the trauma ward, and had the most grounded, focused day I'd had in a year. It turns out, a made-up mind has its own unique kind of peace. Rosalind drafted the lawsuit over the next few weeks. She named the specific statements, the dates, the witnesses who heard Vivienne at the charity gala. She outlined the lost chief of ER promotion, the salary differential, and the documented harm to my professional reputation. Reading the draft was a surreal experience. My entire year of quiet humiliation, neatly categorized and numbered, transformed into something that carried legal weight. When the lawsuit was officially filed in Cook County Circuit Court, the news tore through Chicago faster than any ambulance I'd ever ridden in. Alara Vance sues the Sterling family. Vivienne was apoplectic. She told her country club board that I had gone completely insane, that the grief of an empty home had made me vicious and litigious. She doubled down on every single word she had ever said about me, which, though she didn't realize it yet, was exactly what Rosalind was banking on. Julian initially stayed quiet, and so did Sloane, but my phone started lighting up. Some messages were cruel, others were just nosy, but a few were discreet notes of support from women whose own reputations had been shredded by people claiming to love them. I didn't reply to a single one. I just kept going to work and let the lawsuit move at the speed of the justice system, which is to say, agonizingly slow. Rosalind told me the next step was the defense's formal response. How Julian's high-priced lawyers chose to defend the statements would dictate the entire war. They have two paths, she told me over coffee. They can claim the remarks were just opinions, hurt feelings, nothing actionable. That path is annoying, but we can beat it. She tapped her pen on the table. Or, they can plant their flag. They can claim the statements were a matter of public fact. They can use the truth defense and officially state on the legal record that you absolutely were the medical reason for the infertility. I am praying they take the second path. I asked her why. She smiled like a woman who already had checkmate on the board. Because if they claim it's a medical fact, they have to prove it. And to prove it, they have to open the door. They took the second path. Of course they did. Arrogance rarely chooses the quiet exit. Julian's legal team filed a response that planted their flag exactly where Rosalind wanted it. Their defense, stripped of the legal jargon, was that the statements about me were not defamatory whatsoever, because they were objectively true. I really was the reason the marriage produced no heirs. The biological fault, they argued on official court paper, was medical in nature, and it was entirely mine. When Rosalind called to tell me, I could hear a distinct thrill in her usually stoic voice. "They just said the magic words," she said. "Truth is an absolute defense in defamation." But they didn't think 3 moves ahead. By legally asserting that you were infertile, they have made the reproductive records of both parties the central issue of the case. She paused to let that sink in. Now, I'm not going to paint you a rosy picture. Reproductive medical files are protected by HIPAA. They are the most heavily guarded documents in existence, and no judge hands them over lightly. We still have to convince the court that his records are strictly relevant. But they just argued under penalty of perjury that the defect was definitively you. They cannot make that claim and then refuse to let anyone look at his side of the equation. It's a crack in the armor. It's not a wide-open door, but I can work with a crack. I sat down slowly at my kitchen island, asking her what exactly this meant. Rosalind explained that they had just put Julian's own fertility on the legal chopping block. He had hidden behind my silence for years, but by swearing to it in court, he had given us the legal grounds to finally demand his records through the discovery process. No guarantees, but it was the best shot we had. For 7 years, I was the one whose body was debated at cocktail parties and charity galas. And in trying to legitimize that gossip, in trying to win the lawsuit by shouting it on the public record, the Sterlings did the one thing neither of them had ever been willing to do. They opened the legal door to examine Julian. I thought about him refusing the blood tests years ago. The sharp remarks. The way the topic was violently slammed shut any time I brought it up. I still didn't say anything to Rosalind, but a thread I had buried a long time ago suddenly twitched, and I felt I couldn't sleep that night. So I did what I always do when a patient's symptoms don't match the chart. I ran the timeline backward in my head, slowly and methodically, looking for the detail I had missed the first time. And there it was. 7 years ago. One morning early in our marriage, when Julian drove downtown to a high-end clinic on Michigan Avenue for what he called a routine executive physical. He was gone all day. He came back completely different quiet in a way that didn't fit him, snapping at me for no reason, and he poured himself a heavy glass of scotch before dinner, which he never did on a weekday. I had asked if he was okay. He said the doctor was a quack, that the whole trip was a massive waste of time, and he changed the subject so aggressively it left a bruise on the evening. And here was the part that kept me staring at my bedroom ceiling. After that specific day, he never mentioned getting tested ever again. Not once. Before he went downtown, he had at least pretended to entertain the idea. After that day, the vault was locked. And it was right around that same 3-week window that the very first whispers about me began circulating. At the time, I chalked it up to a man in a foul mood over a wasted afternoon. I didn't connect the dots, because you don't audit the people you love. You don't go looking for a lie. But now, with Rosalind's words echoing in my ears, that quiet Tuesday in downtown Chicago looked less like a wasted trip and a lot more like the exact moment a decision was made. I had no concrete proof. I want to be very clear about that. I had a memory and a bad gut feeling, which mean absolutely nothing in a court of law. But it was enough to tell Rosalind exactly where to aim the subpoena. The next morning, I did just that. Rosalind listened to my story about the Michigan Avenue clinic without writing a single thing down, which I had learned meant she was listening with lethal intent. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. On its own, a memory of a bad mood is circumstantial, she said. But it is probable cause to ask the judge the right question. She explained what would happen next. Because the defense had aggressively attacked my fertility, and because they argued the cause was exclusively me and not him, Rosalind could file a motion to compel discovery of Julian's relevant medical records from that specific clinic. If they want to claim it was you, she said, the law allows me to demand proof that it wasn't him. You can't open the door halfway. She filed the motion the following week. Julian's lawyers fought it like feral dogs, and that was the exact moment I knew I had hit a nerve. Nobody spends tens of thousands of dollars fighting that hard over nothing. They argued HIPAA. They argued privacy rights. They argued irrelevance. They threw every legal roadblock possible to keep that one specific file sealed. A hearing was scheduled, and I had to live in the agonizing space of not knowing. For someone like me, who demands labs and gets immediate answers, this was a unique kind of torture. This was begging a judge for permission just to look. I went back to my ER shifts. I fixed shattered bones, read CT scans, and tried not to think about a manila folder locked in a downtown archive that could either vindicate my entire life or mean absolutely nothing. Rosalind told me to breathe. She said civil courts are designed to move slowly, and that time strips the terror away from the truth. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I had never been afraid of the truth. I was terrified they would find a legal loophole to keep me away from it forever. Before the judge ruled on the discovery motion, Rosalind needed me to sign an affidavit, a sworn statement verifying every claim, every date, every witness, under penalty of perjury. She placed the thick packet on the desk between us in Wicker Park, littered with little yellow sign here tabs. Read every word, she instructed. Only sign what you know in your bones to be true. So I read every line. The charity gala. The hospital donor's wife. The exact phrasing Vivienne used. Some women just aren't built for it. The board of directors meeting, the lost promotion, my years of swallowing the humiliation, all laid out in cold, numbered paragraphs. Reading it did something to me. It made the lie look as fragile as it truly was. I took the pen Rosalind offered, noticing the smell of her office. Not the sterile bleach of my hospital, my old hiding place, but old paper, printer, ink, and the sawdust from the hardware store downstairs. For years, the hospital scent meant safety. Now, safety was here, in a completely different room, a place I had to step out of the shadows to reach. I wasn't hiding anymore. I pressed the pen to the signature line. The gold watch slid coolly against my wrist, and I thought of my grandmother, who used to say that patience isn't just waiting, it's having the clarity to recognize the exact moment when it arrives. This was the moment. My signature was dark and steady. The firmest thing I had done in a year. When I put the pen down, the machine was fully armed. Whatever was sitting in that downtown clinic's archive, the legal gears to extract it were turning, and I was the one who pulled the lever. Rosalind gathered the papers, tapped them against the desk to straighten them, and said all we could do now was wait for the judge. I nodded. For the first time in my life, waiting didn't feel like powerlessness. It felt like watching a lit fuse. The ruling came down on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a quiet ER shift. Rosalind called, and I stepped into a supply closet to answer, surrounded by IV bags and gauze, my heart finally doing the thing it never did at work. The judge granted it, she said, with heavy restrictions, but she granted it. She walked me through it carefully. Because the defense had affirmatively stated my infertility as a weapon, the court ruled that Julian's fertility records were, in the judge's words, presumptively discoverable. It wasn't a free-for-all. The records would be produced under a strict protective order, reviewed in camera, privately by the judge, first, and used only to the extent required to prove or disprove the defense's claims. This doesn't guarantee a smoking gun, Rosalind warned, ever the pragmatist. We don't know what's in the file. It might just be routine blood work. But they can't hide it anymore. I stayed in that supply closet and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 7 years. Across town, I later learned, the news landed like a bomb. Julian's lead counsel supposedly demanded an emergency private meeting with his client that same afternoon. Vivienne called Rosalind's office twice, only to be politely informed that opposing counsel could not speak with her directly. For the first time, the people who had spent a decade dictating the truth about my body went pale at the thought of a judge deciding the truth about his. I didn't celebrate. I want you to understand that. I didn't text anyone. I didn't grin into the bathroom mirror. I finished my shift, charted my patient's progress, and drove home to my apartment in the West Loop alone. But that night, I slept soundly for the first time in months because I knew the file was coming. And unlike people, medical files don't know how to lie. The first crack in their armor didn't come from Julian or Vivienne. It came from Sloane. She sent me a text out of nowhere, after more than a year of absolute radio silence. Please don't do this. Think of the baby. I read it 3 times. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. She had walked away with my husband and my social life, and she hadn't reached out once. And now, suddenly, she was begging me to drop a defamation lawsuit that, on paper, had absolutely nothing to do with her. That was the part that made my brain itch. The lawsuit was between me, Julian, and Vivienne. It was about the slander regarding my career and my body. Why would Sloane, the woman who had supposedly won the ultimate prize, be terrified? Why would a woman sitting in a luxury condo with a husband and a newborn text her former best friend in the middle of the night, begging her to stop digging? People who beg you to stop digging usually know exactly what's buried in the dirt. I had learned that the hard way over the last year. I didn't reply to her. I just sat in the dark, turning the message over in my mind, tracing the outline of a shape I couldn't quite see yet. Here is what I had deduced so far, and what I want you to hear if you have ever been the quiet person standing in the middle of a storm. The people who are most terrified of the truth are rarely the ones the truth is about to fall on. I wasn't angry at Sloane. I was intensely, clinically curious. A curiosity that pierced through to the bone and kept me wide awake. If a quiet woman finally finding her spine sounds like your kind of story, hit subscribe so the algorithm brings you back for the end of this. Let me know in the comments where you would have given up, because I almost did, twice. But Sloane's text didn't make me want to stop. It made me want to press the accelerator to the floor. A panicked person had just accidentally confirmed that there was far more buried in that file than I had ever suspected. The medical file arrived at Rosalind's office 8 days later. I want to be precise about how this happened, because it's important. I didn't see it first. I couldn't, and I wouldn't. I am a physician, and there are medical charts I have absolutely no right to touch, not even my ex-husband's. That is the law, and it is a good law. The documents went directly to Rosalind through the proper legal channels, under the judge's strict protective order. She reviewed them in the presence of Julian's defense attorney, exactly as the system demands. Then, she called me and asked me to come to her office immediately, something she had never done before. I knew the second I sat down in her chair. She had that carefully neutral expression doctors use when they are about to hand a patient something incredibly heavy. 7 years ago, Rosalind started, her voice hushed. Julian went to that Michigan Avenue clinic, the one you remembered. She slid a single, photocopied page across the desk toward me. It was heavily redacted in thick black marker under the court seal, leaving only one line visible. Diagnosis. And next to it, a word I had typed into electronic medical records 100 times. Azoospermia. A complete absence of measurable sperm. Julian had been told, in stark, undeniable clinical terms, that it was medically impossible for him to father a biological child naturally. 7 years ago. The exact same week he came home furious, fundamentally changed, and locked the door on the topic of children forever. The exact same time frame when the whispers about my broken body began to circulate. I remained perfectly still. Rosalind watched me the way you monitor a trauma patient after giving them catastrophic scan results. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt something massive and silent realign inside my chest, like a dislocated shoulder violently snapping back into the socket. For 7 years, I was the defective, barren shame of the Sterling family, and the man who allowed the entire city to believe it had known, the entire time, that the empty house was entirely his doing. I drove home with that single sheet of paper folded in my purse, and I didn't even turn on the radio. I expected to feel triumphant. I was braced for it. I was even a little worried about it, because I didn't want to become someone who took joy in another person's ruin. But the triumph never came. Instead, a strange, suffocating wave of grief washed over me. I had spent 6 years of my prime absorbing a wound that was never mine to bear. Every look of pity from the country club wives. Every time I heard, some women just aren't built for it. Every single night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what was fundamentally wrong with me, why my body had betrayed my marriage. All of it was a fictional narrative Julian had engineered to hide a truth about himself that his ego couldn't survive. He handed me his shame, made me wear it in public for years, and his mother had eagerly fastened it around my neck. I parked my car outside my loft, just like I always seemed to end up sitting in cars at the major turning points of my life. I stared out the windshield and said something out loud to the empty dashboard. The exact same thing I had said to Vivienne in the hospital corridor. Do you really believe that? Except now, I understood what I had actually been asking all along. I had asked the woman who was so profoundly certain I was broken. And the answer, the real answer, had been locked in a downtown clinic's vault the entire time. I wasn't broken. I never was. The relief didn't hit like fireworks. It came like a long, exhausted exhale, the first real breath after months of shallow drowning. But right beneath that relief, a terrifying new question was rapidly taking shape, and once it formed, I couldn't unsee it. Here was the question. If Julian couldn't father a child 7 years ago, if the Michigan Avenue clinic was right, if the diagnosis of azoospermia was absolute, then the baby Vivienne was currently parading around the maternity ward, The son Julian was showing off to the world. The child he had left me to go raise with my best friend could not possibly be his. The arithmetic was brutal, but it was flawless. A man with that specific, untreated diagnosis does not spontaneously conceive a child. It is astronomically improbable without intense, invasive medical intervention Julian never sought, which left a contradiction too massive to ignore. Either the elite fertility clinic had made a catastrophic error, which happens, but rarely, or the child that everyone in Chicago society believed was the sterling heir had been fathered by someone else. I wasn't going to pretend I knew which of those two options was the truth, but I knew it was a question that demanded a biological answer, not high society gossip. And suddenly, that midnight text message from Sloane made perfect, horrifying sense. Please don't do this. Think of the baby. She wasn't worried about my lawsuit hurting Julian's feelings or Vivienne's social standing. She was terrified of what a courtroom full of subpoenaed medical records might accidentally drag into the light. Because Sloane knew something the rest of the Gold Coast didn't. She knew whose baby it actually was. I want to be very careful about what I did next, and what I didn't do, because doing this the right way mattered to me. I did not go digging into the infant's medical charts. I had zero legal or ethical right to do that, and I wouldn't. The baby was completely innocent in this crossfire, and I wished that child nothing but a healthy life. What I had was a glaring contradiction, sitting in plain sight, engineered entirely by the Sterling's own legal defense. They swore under oath that the infertility was mine. The subpoenaed medical record proved it was Julian's. And a healthy newborn across town meant somebody was lying about something much, much bigger than a failed marriage. I called Rosalind from my car and told her I thought there was a lot more buried in the dirt than we initially suspected. She didn't even hesitate. She just said, "Then we let the court find it." Not us. The man who walked through the hospital double doors that day, the one I mentioned at the very beginning of this story, was named Declan. I didn't know him at the time. I learned about him the same way I learned about everything else in this saga. Slowly, legally, and through channels that don't lie. It turned out that in the months Sloane and Julian were getting close, while Julian was still legally married to me and telling the world I was defective, Sloane was heavily involved with someone else. Declan was a quiet guy, an architect by trade, who had been led to believe his relationship with Sloane was serious. When Julian and the Sterling fortune became available, Sloane abruptly dumped Declan, blocked his number, and ghosted him entirely. She never told him she was pregnant. She never mentioned a due date or a hospital. She gambled on the hope that he would just fade away and never connect the dots. But the timeline didn't sit right with Declan. He quietly asked around among the few mutual acquaintances they shared. That Thursday morning, someone slipped up about the hospital name and the delivery date. So, Declan went to Central General to lay eyes on the child he strongly suspected was his. And the exact second he walked through those double doors, the one person Sloane was absolutely certain would never find her, all the color drained out of Sloane's face. That is the image I want you to burn into your mind. Vivienne, puffed up by the elevators, utterly convinced that her son's perfect life was the ultimate proof of my worthlessness. And 5 steps behind her, walking into the maternity ward, the living, breathing proof that their perfect life was built on the exact same foundation of lies they had used to bury me. I didn't orchestrate that moment. I didn't even fully understand the gravity of it as it was happening. I just smiled at Vivienne, asked her if she really believed her own lies, and then the doors hissed open. A stranger walked in, and the entire Sterling castle of glass quietly began to shatter without me having to lift a single finger. It turned out Declan had paternity questions that the family court system was very willing to answer, and in a city where everyone was so incredibly certain they knew the medical truth about my body, the actual truth about everyone else's was finally going to be put on the record. Julian knew. That is what I always come back to. That is the detail that makes this pathetic and unforgivable. He knew for 7 years that he was shooting blanks. So when Sloane told him she was pregnant, he knew with absolute, biological certainty that the child wasn't his. And he went along with it anyway. He stood in front of his mother, his country club, his charity boards, and his entire little elite world, and allowed them to believe he had fathered a legacy. A child that his barren first wife had failed to give him. He used an infant that wasn't even his blood to put the final, triumphant punctuation mark on the fictional story that had ruined my reputation. Think about the sheer audacity of that. The cruelty isn't even the infidelity, or the original lie about my body, although that was heinous enough. The true cruelty is that he looked at a child he knew couldn't be his and saw nothing but a prop, a shield for his ego. I genuinely tried to find an ounce of pity for him. I am a doctor. I am wired for empathy. But every time I tried to extend grace toward Julian, I hit a brick wall. He had 100 opportunities to tell the truth and let me walk away with my dignity. Instead, he built a monument to his own vanity and placed an innocent child right at the top of it. When Rosalind called to tell me that Julian's lawyers had gone completely silent, no more motions, no more aggressive filings, just a frantic request to discuss an immediate settlement, I understood exactly why Julian was no longer afraid of losing the defamation suit. He was terrified of what the lawsuit would say out loud, on the public record, about the child he had been parading around Chicago. For 7 years, he had controlled the narrative. For the first time in his life, the narrative was about to be violently ripped out of his hands. Vivienne came to my loft the day before the final court hearing. She showed up on a Sunday afternoon, wearing her Sunday best, and I almost didn't open the door. When I finally did, she looked a decade older than I remembered. Shrunken. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that, because for a split second, I thought she might. She stood in my doorway and asked me, her voice cracking, to drop the lawsuit. Not for Julian, she pleaded, but for the family, for the baby, for the Sterling name. As she spoke, I saw something I hadn't anticipated. I saw a woman who had been lied to by her own son for 7 years. A widow who had poured her entire existence into raising one boy, building her entire identity around the absolute certainty that he was a good man. She didn't spread those vicious rumors about me because she was inherently evil. She spread them because Julian handed them to her, polished and targeted, and she loved him far too much to ever demand a receipt. For one fleeting second, standing in my own doorway, I pitied her. She was human. She had been used as a pawn, too. But then, she repeated the phrase she had carried like a weapon for years. Except this time, it came out as a desperate plea rather than a royal decree. Some women just aren't built for it, Alara. Why drag everyone through the mud? And I realized that even now, even standing at the absolute precipice of the truth, she would rather protect the lie than let it go. Empathy is not the same thing as surrender. I could see her pain, and still refuse to carry her son's shame for one single day longer. Vivienne, I said quietly, please go home. That mud was never mine. She left without another word. I closed the door, and I didn't feel cruel. I felt done. Julian's lawyers offered a highly lucrative, entirely discreet settlement. They would pay a massive sum. They would issue a private letter of retraction to the hospital's board of directors. They would legally clear my professional name. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement, seal the records, and never speak of the matter again. Rosalind laid the offer on the table and watched my face. She explained that objectively, it was a phenomenal offer. I would get my name back, the hospital board would know the truth, and I would walk away with everything I had originally sued for. She wasn't wrong. On paper, it was a total victory. The promotion was back on the table. All I had to do was let the truth be whispered in a boardroom and then locked in a filing cabinet forever. Meanwhile, Vivienne would still repeat her little phrase at the country club. Julian would still play the triumphant father to a child that wasn't his. And the story of the bitter, barren trauma surgeon would continue to echo through the Gold Coast, where private retractions never reach. I thought about it for a long time. Then I told Rosalind no, not out of spite. I want to be crystal clear, because the distinction matters. I didn't refuse the money because I wanted to see Julian burn at the stake. I refused it because a private truth is just a quieter version of the exact same lie. For 7 years, they had shouted my supposed flaws in ballrooms and charity events, where everyone could hear them. The correction needed to live in that exact same airspace. Not a whisper, not a sealed NDA. The truth, spoken loud, exactly once, right where it mattered, in front of the exact same people who had so eagerly consumed the lie. I told Rosalind I wasn't going to accept a whispered apology for a wound they inflicted with a megaphone. I would say it once on the record, and then I would put the bag of rocks down forever. Rosalind capped her pen, smiled a shark smile, and said, "Then we go to court. Wear something you can breathe easily in." The hearing took place in the Cook County Circuit Court on a crisp, bright Chicago morning. I expected my hands to shake. I had run 1,000 cardiac arrests without a tremor. But this was different, because this time, my own life was bleeding on the table. The courtroom filled up in a way that told you everything you need to know about how high society circles operate. 2 members of the hospital board were sitting in the gallery, there to see exactly how badly they had misjudged me. Several women from Vivienne's charity auxiliary, the very women who had nodded along with her fake pity for years, were huddled together. Vivienne sat rigidly in the second row. Julian sat at the defense table next to his high-priced lawyer, sweating through a custom suit that suddenly looked a size too big. And Sloane sat in the very back, completely frozen. 2 rows behind her sat Declan, the quiet architect, whose presence she could feel without even turning around. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Rosalind, and I felt the entire architecture of the last 7 years converge in this one wood-paneled room. For 6 years, these people had been the audience to my humiliation. They had watched a woman get quietly branded, and they said nothing. Worse, they repeated it. Now, they were going to be the audience for the autopsy. This was the part I had insisted on, the part Rosalind deeply understood. The lie was public. The truth had to be public, in front of these exact eyes, or I would never truly be free of it. I wasn't there to yell. I had decided that weeks ago. I was there to drag the truth into the fluorescent light and nail it to the court record, in the only room in the city where lying has a devastating price tag. The judge took the bench. The gallery fell dead, silent. I felt the cool weight of my grandmother's watch against my pulse, ticking down to the moment I had waited 7 years for. Rosalind didn't raise her voice once. That is what I remember most vividly. She built her argument the exact same way a surgeon builds a diagnosis, one undeniable clinical finding after another, calm and unhurried, until only one conclusion remained. She laid out the defamatory statements, the dates, the witnesses. She read Vivienne's exact quotes into the record. She established the financial damages, the lost chief position, the documented sabotage of my career. Then, she addressed the defense's primary claim, that the statements were legally true, that the infertility was exclusively my fault. To counter this, she asked the judge to admit the medical records that the defense had inadvertently forced into discovery. Under the judge's order, only the relevant line was read aloud. 7 years ago, Julian Sterling was diagnosed at a Michigan Avenue clinic with a condition that made it medically impossible for him to father a biological child. The atmospheric pressure in the room violently shifted. I watched the charity board women whip their heads around to stare at Vivienne, whose face had turned the color of ash. Then, with lethal precision, Rosalind laid the final contradiction on the table, the one the Sterlings had built with their own arrogance. The defense swore the childless marriage was my fault. The medical records proved it was Julian's. Yet, according to the family's very loud public narrative, Julian had recently fathered a son. Rosalind calmly noted for the record that the paternity of said infant was currently the subject of an active petition in the adjacent family court, and that genetic testing in that separate proceeding had officially excluded Julian Sterling as the biological father. She said it cleanly, without theatrical drama, the same way you read a CBC blood panel. And that was when Julian stood up. His voice cracked across the courtroom, stammering that they couldn't do this, that this was out of bounds, his lawyer desperately trying to pull him back down. The judge gave a sharp bang of the gavel, ordering him to sit. Vivienne was on her feet now too, pointing a shaking finger at me, shouting my name like an accusation, screaming that it couldn't be true, that I had fabricated the documents. Mother and son, both loud, frantic, and rapidly disintegrating. While I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, saying absolutely nothing, Vivienne locked eyes with me, grasping for the only weapon she had left, like a drowning woman grabbing a razor blade. Her aristocratic poise completely shattered, and out of the rubble came the only words she knew how to say. "Some women just aren't built for it," she screamed across the aisle. "Some women just aren't." She couldn't even finish it the second time. I stood up, slowly, because I had waited 7 years for this, and I wasn't going to rush it. I didn't shout. I kept my voice flat, clean, and carrying. The exact voice I use when I have to walk into a waiting room and tell a family something incredibly tragic but undeniably true. A voice that is calmer than the room can handle. "You're right, Vivienne," I said. The entire courtroom went cemetery quiet. "You are absolutely right. One person in that marriage was never built to have children." I let the words hang in the freezing air. I looked at Julian, and then back at his mother. But the medical file always had his name on it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, the echo of my wedding vows was playing. The man I had chosen, the future Vivienne had promised, the life I thought I was building, all of it meant one thing back then, and it meant the exact opposite now. Vivienne's arm slowly dropped to her side. Julian buried his face in his hands. And the women from the country club, the ones who had sipped champagne while nodding along to my ruin, sat paralyzed in their pew as the absolute truth finally caught up to them, rearranging every single thing they thought they knew about Chicago's elite. I wasn't defective. I never was. The man who let the entire city believe I was broken was sitting 20 feet away, collapsing into a pile of expensive fabric, while the quiet woman he had tried to bury stood squarely on her own 2 feet. I said it out loud, exactly once, right where it mattered. And then, finally, I let it go. What happened next wasn't cinematic in the way you might expect. There was no screaming match, no bailiffs dragging anyone out in handcuffs. It was much quieter than that, and somehow, infinitely worse for the Sterlings. Julian didn't fight back. He physically couldn't. He sat with his head bowed while his attorney begged the judge for a recess. When the judge granted it, Julian didn't stand up. He just sat there, slumped in his chair, a man watching 7 years of carefully curated fiction evaporate in a single Tuesday morning. The society women gathered their designer coats and purses and filed out of the courtroom in a silent line, keeping their eyes glued to the floor. I knew that by dinner time, the real story would be tearing through the Gold Coast twice as fast as the lie ever did. Vivienne followed them out, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, no longer the general of any campaign. And Sloane? Sloane slipped out the back doors during the recess. But not before Declan stood up from his seat 2 rows back and followed her out into the hallway. The question of that child was finally heading to the family court, where it would be answered with biology, not gossip. I sat back down at the plaintiff's table and let the room empty out around me. Rosalind put a warm hand on my shoulder. She told me I had done it without once losing my composure. She said she'd been practicing law in Chicago for 30 years, and it would shock me how rarely she saw someone actually retain their dignity in this building. The concrete things fell into place over the following weeks. As is usually the case, Julian's social standing, the very thing he had sacrificed me to protect, vaporized overnight. You can't outrun a public court record in those circles. He left Chicago a few months later, moving somewhere down to Florida, to a place where nobody knew his name or his history. He spent 7 years guarding a lie, and in the end, the truth didn't even need me to hunt it down. It just needed to be spoken once, in the right room. The hospital board didn't make a grand spectacle out of their apology, which suited me fine. A few weeks after the ruling, the medical director asked me into his office. He was one of the men who had been sitting in the courtroom gallery. He had the deeply uncomfortable look of a man who realized he had backed the wrong horse and knew everyone knew it. He told me the chief of emergency medicine position was unexpectedly vacant again. He said the board had reconvened, reviewed my file, and determined that the prior concerns regarding my stability were completely unfounded. He didn't explicitly say the words, "I'm sorry," but in corporate hospital administration, that is as close to an apology as you will ever get. I took the job. Not because I needed to win another trophy, but because that department was built with my own hands and my own grueling hours. I wasn't going to let a country club rumor keep me out of my own kingdom for a single day longer. During my first week as chief, I walked into the trauma bay and breathed in that sharp scent of bleach and cotton. It used to smell like a bunker, the only place I was safe from being called empty. Now it smelled entirely different. It smelled like territory I had fought for and won back. It wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was mine. I ran my first code blue as the boss, my hands steadier than they had ever been. Afterward, while I was scrubbing out at the sink, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the supply cabinet. I didn't recognize the exhaustion that used to live permanently behind my eyes. It was gone. I want to tell you I felt vindicated, and I did. But more than that, I felt weightless. Like I had been carrying a 100-pound bag of rocks on my back for 7 years without realizing the straps were unbuckled, and someone had finally tapped me on the shoulder and given me permission to let it drop. People always want to know the epilogue, what happened to everyone else, so I will tell you, and then I will let you go. Julian is gone. Like I said, starting over in a zip code where his name doesn't carry a punchline. I don't wish him ill. Truthfully, I don't wish him anything at all, which is its own profound kind of freedom. Vivienne lost the one thing she built her entire existence around. Not because I took it from her, I never spoke a single word about her to those charity boards, but because the absolute truth about her son was just too large to sweep under a Persian rug. The auxiliary board she ran for 3 decades quietly restructured and moved on without her. I heard she stopped attending the galas altogether. I felt a small, genuine pang of sadness about that. The kind of pity you feel for someone who clung so desperately to a lie that it eventually dragged them under the water. Sloan and Declan settled the paternity and custody issue in family court. For the sake of that little boy, who asked for absolutely none of this nightmare, I hope they found some stability on the other side. Sloan and I never spoke again. Some friendships don't actually break. You just eventually realize they were never what you thought they were, and you set them down on the curb with the rest of the trash. As for me, I kept my job, I kept my loft, and I kept the gold watch on my wrist. I didn't take a single dime of sterling money. I achieved exactly what I set out to do. My name was clean. The truth stood entirely on its own 2 feet, and that was more than enough. There was only one last thing I did before I closed the book. I wrote a short, handwritten note to Vivienne. Not a long letter, and not an angry one. I kept thinking about her standing in my doorway in her Sunday clothes, a woman lied to by her own blood, who still chose the lie. I realized I didn't want to carry an ounce of anger toward her for the rest of my life. Anger is just another bag of rocks. So I kept it simple. I will not carry your son's lie anymore, I wrote, and neither should you. That was it. I dropped it in the mail. I didn't expect a reply, and I never got one. But writing it closed the loop. Tonight, I took my grandmother's watch off my wrist and held it in my palm for a minute. I thought about what she used to say, patience isn't waiting, it's recognizing the right moment when it finally arrives. I waited 7 years for my moment. It came, and I met it head-on. And now, the time that watch ticks away isn't borrowed against some future reckoning. It's just mine. The rest of my quiet, hard-earned life is finally, entirely mine. If you take one single thing away from my story, let it be this. The truth doesn't scream, it doesn't throw tantrums, and it doesn't chase anybody down. It just waits, patient as a ticking watch, right up until the day someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud.